He grabbed my wrist so hard I nearly dropped my champagne glass. I didn't know this man. He was older, maybe mid-70s, silver-haired, wearing a dark blazer with a small American flag pin on the lapel. He'd been standing near the buffet table at my cousin's fundraiser, the kind of event I only attend because my mom guilts me into it. But the moment I reached past him for a napkin, his hand closed around my arm and he went completely still. Not angry still, shocked still. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. I looked down at the bracelet on my wrist. Plain silver chain, small rectangular tag in the middle, engraved with a series of letters and numbers I'd never been able to decipher. I'd worn it so often I'd stopped seeing it. "It was my grandmother's," I said. He let go of my wrist. His face had gone the color of old paper. He took one step back, looked at me like he was trying to find something in my face, and then he said, very quietly, "What was her name?" I told him. He closed his eyes. I need to go back about 8 months to the week my grandmother died. She passed in March in the small room she'd rented for the last 11 years at a residential care facility in central Ohio. She was 81 years old. The facility called my mom first, and my mom called me, and we both sat on the phone in silence for a moment before my mom said, "Well, I guess we need to figure out arrangements." That was it. That was the whole conversation about my grandmother dying. I won't pretend my family was close to her. My mom and her mother had what my mom always described as a complicated relationship, which I later understood to mean my grandmother was cold, she was distant, she worked constantly, she missed things. School plays, birthdays, the years when it mattered. My mom had spent her whole childhood feeling like an inconvenience in her own house. And by the time she left for college, she'd made a quiet decision to stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. I understood that, I did. But I was the one who kept visiting. Not often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. I'd drive the 2 hours from Columbus on a Saturday morning, bring a box of those frosted sugar cookies from the grocery store bakery that my grandmother inexplicably loved, and sit with her in her room for a few hours. We didn't talk about deep things. She'd ask about my job. I'd tell her about whatever project I was working on. She'd nod and occasionally say something sharp and funny that reminded me she was paying more attention than she let on. Then I'd drive home. My mom thought it was a waste of time. My aunt, my mom's sister, had written my grandmother off entirely around the time I was in middle school after some argument I was never told the details of. Nobody in my immediate family had visited in years. "She doesn't even seem to enjoy it when you go," my mom told me once. "She doesn't seem to enjoy much of anything," I said. "That doesn't mean she should be alone." My mom went quiet and changed the subject. So when my grandmother died, I was the one who drove to Ohio. I was the one who went to the facility and signed the paperwork and collected the small box of things from her room. I was the one who stood at the graveside with the funeral director and 2 staff members from the facility. Good women who clearly felt bad that the family turnout was what it was, while my grandmother was buried in the cold March ground. My mom sent flowers. That felt like the right summary of everything. I cried in my car afterward. Not just for her. For the shape of it. For the waste. The box from her room sat in my trunk for 2 weeks before I could bring myself to open it. There wasn't much. A few paperback novels. A framed photo of me at around age 7 that I didn't even know she had. A small wooden jewelry box, the kind with a felt-lined interior and a little brass latch. Some cards and letters bundled with a rubber band that had gone brittle. I opened the jewelry box, expecting costume jewelry. Old brooches, maybe some clip-on earrings. There was one item inside. The bracelet. It was plain silver, not flashy, not decorative. The chain was sturdy, the kind that doesn't tangle. Centered on it was a small rectangular tag, maybe an inch long, with a series of characters stamped into the metal. 2 letters, a dash, 4 numbers, a dash, 3 more letters, like a serial number, like an ID tag, but smaller, more discreet. I turned it over, like an ID tag, but smaller, more discreet. The back was smooth except for a tiny symbol in the corner. Something that looked almost like a stylized compass rose, so small you'd only see it if you were looking. I didn't know what any of it meant. I assumed it was some kind of medical ID, maybe from a hospital stay I didn't know about, or one of those old-fashioned emergency identification bracelets. I put it on because it was hers, because there was almost nothing else, and because it seemed wrong to leave it in a box. I wore it home. I kept wearing it. It became part of the background of my arm, the way jewelry does. I didn't think about it again for 6 months. My cousin Vera's fundraiser was for a local veterans organization. Her husband served 2 tours in Afghanistan and has been involved in the advocacy work ever since. It's a nice event, usually held at a rented hall, with a silent auction and speeches and a lot of people in blazers shaking hands. I go because I love Vera and because free food. I was not thinking about my grandmother. I was thinking about whether the cheese plate had been refilled and whether I could slip out by 9 without being rude. Then the man grabbed my wrist. His name was Dr. Harold Fenn, retired. He'd spent 30 years working for a federal agency he described only at first as a government research division. He was attending the fundraiser because his son-in-law was on the organization's board. He had the slightly formal, carefully measured way of speaking that I've since come to associate with people who spent decades choosing their words very deliberately. He asked me to step outside with him. I probably shouldn't have gone. I didn't know him, but there was something in his face. Not threatening, nothing like that. It was the face of someone who has just seen a ghost and is trying to decide whether to say so. We stood on the sidewalk outside the hall. It was September, still warm. He looked at the bracelet again, and then he looked at me. "What do you know about your grandmother's work?" he asked. "She was a seamstress," I said. "She ran a small alteration shop for most of her life." He nodded slowly. "That's what she told people." I looked at him. "That's what she was supposed to tell people," he said. "That was the cover." What he told me that night I've since been able to partially verify through documents that took me 4 more months to track down. I'm going to tell you what I know to be true, and I'm going to be honest about the parts I still can't fully confirm. My grandmother, quiet, distant, perpetually unremarkable, had spent approximately 30 years of her adult life as a civilian contractor working in human intelligence support. Not a spy in the movie sense, not field operations. She was what Dr. Fenn described as a document specialist and network facilitator, which I eventually came to understand meant she was one of the people who built and maintained the false identities used by field operatives. She created cover stories. She built the paper trails. She made people disappear into new lives and made sure those lives held up under scrutiny. She had been recruited in her early 30s when she was already running the alterations shop. The shop was real. She did do alterations. But it was also a reason to work with paper, with records, with the kind of detailed, hands-on documentation work that translated directly to what her actual employers needed. She had signed agreements that required her to tell no one. Not her husband, not her children, not ever. The bracelet is an internal identifier, Dr. Fenn told me. Everyone in the program had one. They weren't worn publicly. Most people kept them hidden. The fact that she had it still, that she kept it, means something. "What does it mean?" I asked. He thought about that for a moment. "It means she didn't want to be completely invisible," he said, "even if no one knew what they were looking at." I had to look away for a second. He told me he had worked adjacent to her program for nearly a decade, in a coordinating capacity. He had known her by her identifier, the alphanumeric code on the bracelet, before he ever knew her face or her name. When the program was restructured in the late 90s, he'd been part of the transition team. He knew what she had contributed. He knew the particular operations her work had supported, the operatives who had lived for years inside the identities she'd built for them. She was exceptionally good, he said, careful, methodical, the kind of person who understood that the work was invisible by design, and she was okay with that. Some people aren't. She was okay with a lot of things, I said, and I didn't entirely mean it as a compliment. He heard that. She would have had to choose, he said carefully. Every person in her position made the same choice in one form or another, the work or the life. She chose the work. I don't think it was easy. I thought about my mother, 7 years old, waiting at a school play for a woman who never showed up. "No," I said. "I don't think it was easy either. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel and my mind going in about 14 directions at once. Part of me wanted to dismiss it. Dr. Fenn was an older man at a fundraiser. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he'd seen the bracelet and constructed a story around it. People do that, especially with things that feel mysterious. But there was the way he'd gone pale. The way he'd known, from across a buffet table, what he was looking at, the specific details, the compass rose symbol, the exact format of the identifier code that he'd named before I described them. And there was the thing I kept coming back to. Alone in the dark of my car, it explained things. It explained why she'd been so absent, why she never talked about her work beyond the surface level, why there were years of her life she simply didn't discuss, why she had always seemed, even in her quietest moments, like someone carrying a weight that didn't belong to the room she was in. I had spent years vaguely resenting her on my mother's behalf. The missed birthdays, the emotional distance, the sense that she was always slightly somewhere else. She was, just not in the way I'd assumed. I called my mom the next morning. I didn't tell her everything right away. I asked her first, as casually as I could manage, if she knew anything about my grandmother's work beyond the alterations shop. Long pause. She always seemed busier than someone running a small shop should be, my mom said slowly. But she never explained it. I assumed she was just, I don't know, private. Did she ever mention anything about government work? Contracts? Anything like that? Another pause. Why are you asking? I told her about Dr. Fenn. My mom was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Mom? I'm here. Her voice had changed. Not upset exactly. Something more complicated than that. I always knew there was something she wasn't telling us. I just thought she didn't love us enough to be present. I didn't think. She stopped. I know. That doesn't make it okay, she said. Her not being there, even if she had reasons. No. I agreed. It doesn't. But she exhaled. It's something. It's different from nothing. We talked for almost 2 hours. My mom cried once, briefly, and then pulled herself together the way she always does and started asking practical questions. Could we verify any of this? Were there records? What exactly did Dr. Fenn say she did? I told her everything I knew, which was still mostly incomplete. She should have found a way to tell us, my mom said near the end of the call. I don't care about the agreements. She should have found a way. Maybe she thought she was protecting you, I said. Maybe she was. Silence. I still needed my mother. I didn't have an answer for that. There isn't one. I spent the next 4 months trying to verify what Dr. Fenn had told me. It was not easy. Most of what I requested through official channels came back either heavily redacted or as a polite form letter explaining that records from that program were not subject to public disclosure. I hired a researcher who specializes in government records. She found a few things: a civilian contractor file with my grandmother's name attached to a federal agency, most of the content blacked out, a commendation notation, no description, just a date and a case number, a single internal memo from the late 90s that mentioned the program restructuring Dr. Fenn had described and listed a set of identifier codes among the personnel being transitioned out. One of those codes matched the bracelet. I sat at my kitchen table looking at a photocopy of a government document I paid $200 to partially obtain, and I thought about a woman who spent 30 years building invisible lives for other people and came home every night to a family who thought she was just tired. I went back to the care facility in December, not entirely sure why. I spoke with one of the nurses who had known my grandmother in her last years, a kind woman named Angela who had been there the morning she died. I told her I'd been learning some things about my grandmother's life that I hadn't known before. Angela nodded like this didn't entirely surprise her. She used to say things sometimes, Angela told me, when she was very tired or when she'd had a difficult night. Small things that didn't quite fit. I never pushed. But I always had the feeling there was a lot more to her than she let on. Did she ever seem lonely? I asked. Not just from us being away. I mean in herself. Angela thought about it. She seemed like someone who had made peace with something, she said. Not happy exactly, but settled. Like she'd decided a long time ago what her life was going to cost, and she paid it, and she wasn't going to keep arguing about the price. I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. In February, I went to see my aunt, my mom's sister, the one who'd cut off contact years ago. I drove 4 hours to her house in western Pennsylvania and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which I hadn't expected. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me once, when I was about 14, if I understood that people could love you in ways that don't look like love. I waited. I told her that was a convenient thing for people to say when they were bad at showing up. My aunt smiled slightly, not happily. She didn't argue. She just nodded and said, "You're right. I know." She paused. I've thought about that conversation a lot over the years. I always took it as an admission. Now I wonder if it was the closest she could ever come to explaining. We sat in that kitchen for a long time. Dr. Mino. Fen and I have stayed in contact. He's been helpful within what he'll allow himself to say in pointing me toward the right archives, the right people, the right language for the requests I've been filing. He's in his late 70s and has the deliberate patience of someone who spent a career operating in systems that required it. Last spring, he told me something he said he'd been deciding whether to share. There was, apparently, a quiet internal acknowledgement issued to contractors in my grandmother's position after the program was officially closed. Not public, not ceremonial, just a notation in the internal record that recognized their contribution. It was the kind of thing that would never appear in a newspaper or a ceremony or a framed certificate on a wall. He'd helped draft the language. He said her name was on it. She never told anyone. She never had the option to. But somewhere in a file that will probably remain sealed for another 20 years, her name appears in a list of people who were told, in the carefully bureaucratic language of a classified document, that what they did mattered. She knew. That's what I keep telling myself. She knew. The bracelet is still on my wrist. I've thought about whether to take it off, whether it should go somewhere more official, whether I should donate it to an archive or put it somewhere more meaningful than my own arm. I've decided, for now, to keep wearing it. Not because I've resolved everything. Not because I've found the clean ending where the grief gets explained away and the absence becomes acceptable. I haven't. My grandmother was not available to us in the ways we needed her to be. My mom grew up with a mother who was there in body and elsewhere in spirit, and that wound is real regardless of what caused it. My aunt spent decades carrying an anger that now has new context but hasn't disappeared. And my grandmother died in a small room in Ohio with one granddaughter at her graveside because the life she had built, the one visible to her family, hadn't given anyone enough reason to show up. That is a loss. It is also, maybe, only part of the story. I think about the operatives whose lives held together because she built them carefully. The people who came home because the identities she created were airtight. The years of work she did in total silence, with no recognition, carrying the particular weight of someone who cannot explain to the people she loves why she is the way she is. I think about her wearing that bracelet, not in public, not in a way anyone would notice, just wearing it privately in the last years of her life in that small room, the only visible reminder that she existed inside a story no one else could read. Angela said she'd made peace with what her life had cost. I hope she had. I really do. I wore her bracelet to my mom's house for Thanksgiving last year. My mom saw it when I reached for something at the dinner table. She recognized it immediately. She'd seen it in childhood, she said, once or twice, and had always wondered. She reached over and touched it, just lightly, with 2 fingers. She didn't say anything, neither did I. Some things don't need words, some things just need someone to finally notice them after all this time, and say with the quietest possible gesture, "I see you. I see what you carried. I see you now." I keep thinking about the moment my mom reached across the Thanksgiving table and touched that bracelet with 2 fingers. No words, just that. It took me, Almost a year of digging through redacted documents and late-night phone calls and one conversation with a stranger on a sidewalk to get to that quiet moment. And I've been sitting with something ever since. The reason we almost missed it entirely wasn't cruelty. It was assumption. We looked at my grandmother's life and decided we already understood it. We saw the distance, the missed birthdays, the silences, and we filed them all under one explanation and stopped asking questions. That's the thing that costs you the most, I think. Not malice, just the certainty that you already know. Dr. Fenn recognized that bracelet because he'd spent decades paying attention to things other people walked past. That's not a small quality. That kind of careful, rigorous attention, the willingness to look closely at what's actually in front of you instead of what you expect to find, is something my grandmother had too in her own way. It's what made her good at her work. She built entire lives out of details that had to be exactly right. She understood that getting something wrong because you weren't paying attention had real consequences for real people. I think about that when I consider how differently things might have gone. My mom spent decades carrying an anger built on an incomplete picture. My aunt made a permanent decision based on a conversation she only half understood. I visited, but even I had constructed a version of my grandmother that fit what I could observe, and I never pushed past the surface. We all acted on the information we had. The problem was, we stopped at the information we had. There is a kind of integrity in refusing to do that, in staying curious about the people in your life even when they're difficult, even when they don't make it easy, even when the easier thing is to decide you've seen enough. My grandmother couldn't tell us who she was. But we also never asked with any real persistence. Those are two separate failures, and they compounded each other across 30 years. What I keep returning to is the bracelet itself. She kept it. Through all of it, the silence, the isolation, the weight of a life that couldn't be explained to the people she loved. She kept one small object that said, "This is real, this happened, I was here." That's not passivity. That's someone holding on. That's a specific kind of endurance that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for recognition, just continues. I don't know how to fully reconcile what my grandmother did with what it cost her family. I don't think I'm supposed to arrive at a clean answer, but I know that the moment I started asking real questions instead of accepting the version of her I'd inherited, that's when she became a person to me instead of a symbol of absence. She deserved that a long time ago. So did my mom. I'm trying to be the kind of person who asks before it's too late.